And then too, some of the most developed countries, and the dispensationalists, for instance, Fruchtenbaum mentioned Germany and Russia, will send their crack troops against Israel with bows and arrows and hand staves. So that, like Robin Hood, bow and arrow, and Friar Tuck with his stave. In other words, Gog and Magog, according to a literalistic reading of Ezekiel 38 and 39, would be like Robin Hood and his merry men. Only more than several dozen of them. A huge army. With the weaponry that you would associate with Sherwood Forest. And then think too, just to stick with verses 8 through 10, of Israel's fuel. Israel's fuel in this passage is not oil or gas or even coal, it's wood. The nation of Israel, as portrayed here, is heated by wood fires. Then to think of it, that Gog and Magog's weapons provide fuel for Israel for 7 years. Think about the number 7. 7 is the number of the covenant. Covenant destruction of the enemies of the triune God and his people. That's what this is dealing with. Then move on to verses 11 through 16 from the fuel of the weapons of Gog and Magog to the burial of Gog and Magog's armies. According to this passage, if you take it literally, it takes the whole nation of Israel, 7 months to bury the dead. What about some bulldozers? 7 months. The whole country employed in burying the dead for 7 months. And again, 7 months, the number of the covenant, a symbolic number, as in that other apocalyptic book, the book of Revelation. And where is the valley of Hamon Gog, if we identify its location properly? The other side of the Dead Sea. Today that's in the land and nation of Jordan, a foreign country. So they're going to bury their dead in Jordan. And then notice this too, the burial of the dead is not simply a burial of the dead. It's a burial of the dead which is a cleansing. Dead bodies, in the thought world of this prophecy, dead bodies mar the land by making it unclean. So you have in verse 12, the burying was so that they may cleanse the land. Verse 14, they go throughout the land in order to cleanse it. Verse 16, thus shall they cleanse the land. The idea of the bone, putting a sign beside the bone, is not only to help the disposal unit locate it and then bury it, but so that no other passerby knocks on it and then becomes unclean. The thought world here is that of the Old Testament laws of ceremonial uncleanness. So if you're a dispensationalist and you're going to take this literalistically as referring to the future, you've got a world in which there's ceremonial uncleanness. And you can't just take the Old Testament laws about ceremonial uncleanness and say, well, they're going to be enforced, but not all these other ones, because they're all interconnected and interwoven. Once you bring back the law of uncleanness, so that touching a dead body makes you unclean, then a woman's period or an oozing wound makes you unclean. Then if you're unclean, how do you deal with that? Rites of purification. Certain rites which involve, let's say, the ashes of a heifer or the sprinkling of water. And then if you have uncleanness being addressed by purification with certain rites, you need priests. priests after the order of Aaron. And then you need sacrifices, and then we're going to have to kill animals and sprinkle blood and eat altars, holy places, temples. This is Judaizing, bringing back the laws of Moses, which the Apostle Peter said, and he was the apostle to the Jews. Bringing back these laws constitutes a yoke, a heavy yoke on your neck, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear. That's what you get. Once you start taking it literalistically, you end up back with Judaism and all these laws. Listen to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 9, referring to the tabernacle. The tabernacle, you can apply this to the temple, was a figure. It was symbolic for the time then present, the Old Testament, in which were offered gifts and sacrifices. You kill animals that could not make the person who offered them perfect as pertaining to the conscience. These things, verse 10 goes on to say, priests, sacrifices, purifications, they were only a matter of food and drink, and diverse washings and cleansings, and carnal, fleshly, outward ordinances imposed upon them for a time, until the time of Reformation would come, when Christ would come and be the fulfillment of all these types and shadows and bring in the better, higher state. Because, verse 11 says, Christ being come, a high priest of good things to come, brings in a better tabernacle and brings in better blood, his own, and a better cleansing and purification. And we're not going to go back. We're not going to go backwards to any Old Testament laws when Jesus Christ, the better priest, with a better covenant, better blessings, brings us into the age of fulfillment. And so, whereas in Ezekiel 39, using Old Testament language, the land is cleansed by human hands, burying bones of Gog and Magog. Well, in the reality, when God comes to cleanse the world, as 2 Peter 3 says, he doesn't need to employ a few guys full-time and signs and all that. He sends fire and refines the world and cleanses it that way. And what about the consumption of people and their horses by the birds and the beasts in verses 17 to 20? This is a vivid, very graphic way to refer to the total destruction of God's enemies in an awful, apocalyptic slaughter. Ezekiel 38, especially now 39, I say, points in various ways to the fact that it is not to be taken literally. And if there were any doubt remaining from that, we have the inspired New Testament interpretation given for us in the book of Revelation. We're back to Revelation 20 again. Revelation 20 verse 7 says, when the 1,000 years are expired, the end of the New Testament period, Satan is loosed from his prison. He's the one, ultimately, who's stirring up Gog and Magog. Loosed from his prison. And this happens, to use the language of verse 3, in Satan's little season, that little sliver at the end of the New Testament period, just prior to Christ's glorious return. Satan goes out to seize the nations in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, the whole world, and gathers them together as back to battle, and they are as numerous as the grains of sand on the beach. So they go up on the breadth of the earth and compass the camp of the saints, the beloved city of the church. Not in some mountains in Israel, that's Old Testament language. And fire comes down from God out of heaven and destroys them. And fire is the one that's mentioned most in Ezekiel 38 to 39. It's fire in chapter 39 verse 8 that comes down on the islands and upon Magog. And fire and brimstone are the culminating judgments according to the list given near the end of Ezekiel 38.